Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 231. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Francine Falk-Allen about her new book, A Wolff in the Family. This novel has its origins in Francine's own family history. About 20 years ago, she learned a family secret that very few of her living relatives knew. While attending a funeral, Francine discovered that the 5 youngest of her mother's 11 siblings were sent to an orphanage by her grandfather. It was Francine's mother, the eldest of the siblings, who kept them in touch with each other through the years. In A Wolff in the Family, Francine explores the family's hardships during the 1920s and 30s, and the circumstances that would lead a father to place his own children in an orphanage, as well as the effects that decision had on the rest of the family. In this episode, I'll chat with Francine about her writing journey, what she learned about her family, and the reasons they kept the secret for so many years, and how this story ties into her first book, a memoir about contracting polio at age 3 and learning to live with the effects of that virus, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Francine Falk-Allen, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, hi, Stacey. Nice to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, A Wolff in the Family. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
This book is based on some family history that I learned about 20 years ago, which was a big surprise to me because I thought I pretty much knew everything about my mother's family. And she was the eldest of 12 children. But I went to a memorial service long after my mother had died for one of her brothers. There were 12 kids in the family at the time. And so I'm sitting across from my Aunt Dorothy, and we're just having egg salad sandwiches like you do at after memorial services. And she just offhandedly said, well, when we were in the orphanage, and then she went on to speak about something slightly, not related to that. And I said, wait a minute, Aunt Dorothy, what are you talking about? What orphanage? So then she told me the story just briefly in 2 or 3 sentences. And I was astounded that my mother had never told me that her 5 youngest siblings had been put into an orphanage by my grandfather at one point. And there were reasons that this happened. And I started pulling the information out of other family members and thought at the time I had been working on my first 2 books, and I thought one of these days I'm going to write this story. And I decided that it had to be a fiction because I only had bits and pieces, but I did research census records and all whatever I could find, newspaper records, and pulled out as many facts as I could, and then put together a fiction about this story. So that's how it originated.
Let's talk about the research you had to do for this. I imagine there was some genealogy research you did, A, and then B, research into, say, time and place, setting, that sort of thing. But let's go back to your dive into your family, that part of the research. Did you find that easy enough to do? Where did you go to look for this information? And did the rest of your family know about it? Were they a source for you?
My sister, who was from a previous marriage and was 19 years older than me, didn't know about this either, which really surprised me
Oh.
because my mother and my sister were actually closer than I was to my mother, and I thought certainly she would have known, and she didn't. And so I thought, my gosh, who knows? So I had the opportunity to speak to an aunt who was the second oldest in the family, and she told me other things. I actually didn't know about the orphanage at that time, thinking back. She told me some other things about the family. So I just talked to whoever would talk about it, and some people would say, well, I'll get back to you, and they wouldn't. But I wasn't really close to my cousins, and they were the ones whose parents might have told them things. And recently, I have learned that a lot of my cousins didn't know anything about this. So it seems to be something that some of the family spoke about, some of the siblings that were in the orphanage, actually, and some of them did not. I did get a letter from an aunt who, because I asked her about it, I wrote and asked her about it, and she told me things that sounded like maybe her memory wasn't completely clear, but those were other tidbits. So I didn't get a lot from the family, but I pulled together everything I could. Another aunt told me that one of my uncles had told her some other things. So I pulled those things in because they did seem to be factual. So it was bits and pieces with regard to the family. But the family was not a huge resource. I pulled as much as I could from them. My sister knew a little bit, but she didn't know anything about the orphanage or why the children had been put there.
Well, let's go back to the beginning then. Let's introduce everyone to Frank and Naomi Wolff because it sounds like that's where this particular story starts.
Right. So I did know my grandfather. He lived down the street from me for a few years before he died. And I found him to be aloof and not particularly affectionate. And I have one story at the end of the book that illustrates that he had a vindictive personality about a rather minor event that happened between him and my mother. My mother was quite devoted to him. She was the eldest daughter, and I imagine she was daddy's little girl, from the beginning. And I never knew my grandmother, my real grandmother. I thought that the woman that lived with my grandfather, who was his wife when I knew them down the street as a child, was my real grandmother, and asked my mother about that when I was about 10 or 11. And then she told me, no, she's not your real grandmother. Your real grandmother died when you were 2. And so I never got to really meet her. So I had to make up her personality entirely. But knowing some of the things that she went through and being a woman who's been married once before and now in a much better marriage and has had a number of boyfriends that were difficult, I felt like I knew what it was like, and I knew that the kinds of conversations they must have had while he was away on the railroad all the time. He was a railroad engineer, first a fireman and then an engineer. He was gone all the time, and she was home popping out babies, one after another, almost one a year. It must have been incredibly difficult. And I've recently heard from another cousin that her father, one of my uncles, told her that it was really difficult for his mother, that she was working hard all the time with all these children, just cooking and cleaning and trying to make ends meet, trying to manage the money that my grandfather doled out. So those are the things I know about them for sure. And it wasn't really difficult to create what the dynamic must have been between them.
Let's talk a little bit about setting, time and place for this story because it obviously has a big impact on what happened and the characters themselves. So set the scene for us, if you will.
Most of it takes place in Ogden, Utah, because my grandfather was stationed there with the railroad. Previous to that, they had lived in Kansas, and each of their parents, each of Naomi and Frank's, now you have to know that their last name was really not Wolff. I was looking for a Germanic name that started with W because the real name was a Germanic name that started with W. But as it turns out, Wolff was perfect. It was a perfect last name. So they had lived in Kansas, and one of their Frank's parents had a farm in Missouri, and Naomi's family had a farm in Kansas. So they were farm kids growing up. And I'm guessing that when he started working for the railroad and they began living in towns, that it improved the quality of Naomi's life physically in some ways. In Ogden, I believe they had indoor plumbing, and they hadn't had that previously when they lived in Salina, Kansas. So it was a rural atmosphere, and Ogden was a big city for them. And Ogden was in the 1920s and 30s, it was a thriving area, and the railroad had changed the United States incredibly and brought so much commerce and many people out to the west. And Ogden was one of the centers. So they were enjoying being able to shop at a grocery store instead of only having produce from the farm. And I looked up lots of information about Ogden and the other places that they were living. I found old newspaper articles, and I well, I don't know how far you want to go into this, but I used census records to determine where they actually were, where all the people in the book actually were at the time, as best I could. Of course, you only get 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940. It's not like there's anything in between. So I also read Wallace Stegner's book, The Big Rock Candy Mountain, because for him, it was a fictionalized memoir about growing up with his family, and his father was a rough and tumble kind of guy who was domineering, and that was not uncommon in those days. So I got a sense of that Salt Lake City was a big city, and it wasn't all Mormon. It was, a lot of people from other faiths were living there as well, and they had streetcars and all that sort of thing in the early 1900s. So it wasn't as completely Wild West as you might think, but I also learned that some of the famous cowboys like Bat Masterson and all of those people had been very active in Kansas and Wyoming and those areas. And some of the villains, the James boys and all of that sort of thing, some of those had been very active only 30 or 40 years before this story takes place. So they were coming out of the Wild West into something more civilized. So those are the things that I found out when I was working on the story.
Interesting. Okay. And so the picture you paint then in the book is about a marriage, but the couple spend most of their time apart. And Naomi is left much on her own, raising this large family.
Correct. Yeah.
What did you fill in? Because I imagine the story leads to a climax, right? Leads to whatever happens and creates this secret that everybody then kept. So what did you have to do in the story to kind of fill in and build to that point?
I decided to start the story with Frank having just come back from the orphanage and dropping the kids off and having some sadness and reflecting on it, and feeling like he had to do that, so that from the beginning that he's put his kids in an orphanage. And it's 1929, so you may think that it's because of the Depression. And I wanted to create that deception because later on in the story, you find out that that has little to do with it. Mm. But I wanted to carry that forward so that the reader was going to think, well, he's had to put them in the orphanage. It was a rough time for everyone. And then I go back to 1918 and start with when they first moved to Ogden. I made that choice because my mother would have been about 10, and she had told me repeatedly that she got sick of taking care of so many children because she was the eldest daughter. And my aunt, who was the second oldest, also told me that they spent a lot of time taking care of these kids. My mother came to resent it greatly. And so I just imagine, okay, what's it like if you're a 10-year-old kid and you're spending, instead of playing outside with your friends a lot of the time, you're spending a great deal of time taking care of children that are maybe 8, 7, 6, 5, 2 years old. what would your attitude be about that? She also told me that because she was the eldest, she was the last one in the tub on Saturday nights. They took a once a week bath, and first the babies were washed, and then the next bigger kids. So there are a number of things, there are a number of anecdotes in the early part of the book that are factual from my mother's history. The work for me was creating the conversations and what did the inside of the rooms look like, what was going on. I had looked up, well, given his salary, because I looked up what his salary would have been, would they have been able to afford a vacuum cleaner? Probably not, not in the beginning anyway. And so I had my mother using a carpet sweeper, and there were things like that. There were details like that that I put together, and then I knew that she and her next sister didn't get along really well. My mother was fond of her father, and my aunt was fond of her mother. And so there was another tension there between the sisters. And several of my aunts and uncles told me that my mother was more like my grandfather than she was like my grandmother. And so even though I didn't know my grandmother, I just decided to create her personality as being a sweet but sort of frustrated person by having so much to do. And my mother had also told me that my grandmother bit her nails to the quick, and that drove my mother crazy. So because of that, I thought she was nervous. She was a nervous woman. She was biting her nails all the time, and she may have been self-conscious about that too. So there were little bits and pieces that allowed me to create a personality. And I also knew that a lot of my aunts and uncles, some of them finished high school, some of them didn't. So I knew that they were intelligent but not very well educated. Although in those days, education was probably a little better than it is now. I mean, they got algebra earlier than kids do now, that sort of thing. But I knew how they spoke too. I had conversations with several of my aunts and uncles, so the vernacular that I use is very common to that family. So I had some clues and I filled in the blanks basically.
Yeah. And it seems a, a miracle, actually, that a family so large was able to keep their secret for so long.
They were ashamed. Not all of them, but some of them were very ashamed. They were ashamed of what had happened to lead up to the orphanage incident, and they were ashamed because of what happened afterwards, because there were more repercussions after the orphanage. Things changed again, and they all were able to eventually stay in touch with each other, but nobody talked about it. I mean, just a couple of the aunts, like for instance, my Aunt Dorothy evidently was very open about it, so her children must have known. But because we weren't all in close contact all the time, people weren't talking about those days with each other. And my mother was very ashamed of her mother and also ashamed of what her father had done. I'm convinced of that because I knew her, and she was very judgmental and moralistic. And this entire family was a Christian family, and I think that some of the moral repercussions and I don't know the events were just stunning to them, and they didn't want people to know that they had that in their family history. I think this wasn't uncommon in those days. I've spoken with a lot of people since then who have said, I just found out that my grandfather had another family we didn't know about, that
Mm.
sort of thing. So if you go back a ways, there was so much stigma about any type of abnormality in your family that it's not uncommon for people to keep its secrets back in those days. And this is nearly 100 years ago.
Well, and I'm curious, and without giving any spoilers, to the extent you can share any information with us, you said the siblings kept in touch. Were they reunited at any particular stage?
In some respects, yes, because my mother was the first to move out of Utah. And when she became an adult, she moved to Los Angeles and married a man that she had met in Ogden. And one by one, most of the siblings came down to live with her to establish themselves in California as well. So most of them ended up in Southern California, and there were two that were in, well, actually, there was one that stayed in Wyoming and one that was there for a while and then moved to Los Angeles. And there was one that moved to Illinois, and then there was another who lived in Los Angeles for a while and then moved to Florida. And he was on the outs with several of the family members, and he was kind of shunned by some of the family. But my mother had him on her Christmas card list. I found this not too long ago, and she had him in her address book, and she sent Christmas cards to all of her brothers and sisters every single year. So she did keep in touch with them, even though she had judgments about a lot of them. It was sort of like, well, I can't stop being in touch with them. They're my brothers and sisters, you know? So it's funny. I mean, they were able to like put it aside and talk about superficial things, I guess.
Hmm. It sounds like your mother actually played an important role then in keeping them in communication, if not in the same locale, at least in communication. If she hadn't been as diligent about that, do you think they would have? Do you think other
I
people would
think
have
some of
stepped
them
up?
would have stayed in touch. Yeah, I think some of them would have stayed in touch. One of my cousins told me recently that her father didn't keep in touch with the brother in Florida at all, and they were twins. So that's a pretty big deal. And I don't know, you know, she was the big sister. They all considered her their big sister. So they went to her, you know, when they needed help, apparently. And my sister told me that, and my sister, of course, lived in Los Angeles with my mother originally. And she told me that my mother really just hated it that everybody came and stayed with her all the time because she'd been taking care of them all of her life, you know. And
Right.
now they show up in LA as adults and want to stay with her until they get themselves established. And she's cooking for them again, you know. Well, and she had a part-time job too, so, and was trying to raise a couple kids. I also think it's interesting that this is not what you asked, but I think it's interesting that most of my aunts and uncles did not have big families. I mean, I think the biggest was four children after having grown up in a family with, you know, my grandmother bore 14 children in that family, and a couple of them were stillbirths. So after growing up in a big family like that, they all apparently figured out how to avoid that.
Well, now that your family knows about this secret, the extended family, the cousins, the the children of the people who were originally involved, what are their reactions? What's the impact on your family having now sort of outed this situation?
Right. I'm not in close touch with most of them, and some of my cousins have already died because I'm 77 and some of them were older than me. And interestingly, I've had a lot of conversations with one cousin, and she said she's really glad to have all the information, and she hadn't known about any of this either. And she said that her father never talked about his parents, and particularly his mother, who was the person that, you know, everyone thought caused all the scandals, which I think is sort of a left-handed way of looking at it. I think my grandmother made decisions that were predictable, you know. But anyway, and then I have another cousin whose wife read the book and she hasn't gotten back to me, but she really liked the story. And they know that it's not 100% true, you know, it's based on facts, but not everybody has gotten in touch with me. And the cousin that has been in touch said she bought several of the books and gave them to people, and another cousin told me he bought it. I mean, you know, they all want to read it, but
Right,
whether
right.
they're going to be happy about it, I don't know. One of my aunts in her eulogy had, whoever wrote it had said that they were in the orphanage because of financial difficulty, which really wasn't true. So I know that that's the way she wanted it presented. I was in an orphanage at one point, and it was because my dad didn't have money to take care of us, and that just wasn't true. So she wanted that to be the story that was put out there. So I don't know. I don't know what the rest of the cousins are going to say. I keep hoping to hear from them, and I figured the all the characters in the book are dead except me. So, they can't sue me if they don't like it. And it's mostly true. So we'll
Right,
see. We'll see if
right.
I hear from more of them.
And that leads me to, I guess, my next question, because I was going to say this isn't your first book. It's your first, it's a foray into fiction, but you've got
Yes,
two other books out,
right.
and you are mentioned in this book, A Wolf in the Family. But as we mentioned before we started recording, this book, your third book, in some ways is sort of a prequel to your first book that came out. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. This book ends with me. Well, I won't tell you everything that it ends with, but I do come in at the very end in a epilogue. That's what it is. I had to think. I almost called it a eulogy, but no, no, it's the epilogue. So in the epilogue, I come in at the end, and that segment is my direct recollection. So it's like memoir. The rest of the book is not memoir because I wasn't there for it. But yes, I'm like 9 years old at that point. And in fact, my first book, Not a Poster Child, is a memoir of my life of growing up with a disability, which was due to polio, and how I navigated the world as a woman with a disability and how it affected many choices that I made in my life. And Frances, the oldest daughter in A Wolff in the Family, is my mother, and she, of course, appears in my memoir quite a lot. And she had a lot of people in those days would paddle their children, and she did that with a wooden paddle. And part of why I constructed her personality in A Wolff in the Family is to show that what you learn from your parents or grandparents is passed on to your children. And so she learned that kind of discipline in that family. And I think that she felt bad about it a lot of the time, but she thought it was the only way to discipline kids and to raise them to do a life the way she wanted it, whether it was what the child wanted or not. So there's a very strong segue because you read about Frances in this book and you find out, all what her childhood was like and the choices that she made. And then if you after that read Not a Poster Child, you'll see how she carried what she learned into my life directly. I think it's kind of a good segue, and the writing is similar because I wrote a lot of scenes and dialogue in my memoir. That's where I learned to write scenes and dialogue with the coaching of a really good editor. She said, "You're telling the story. Now show us what happened. Bring the people in." I said, "Well, I don't remember every single conversation, and this is a memoir. I want to be truthful." And she said, "But you remember what was said. You remember how you felt. You remember the scenes where the conversations took place. So just make them colorful." And I watch a lot of movies, so I thought, okay, I can do this. And I brought that to the novel as well.
Well, now that you've written in a number of different genres, looking back, do you have a favorite now? Do you think you have found one that appeals to you more, or in which you feel the most comfortable, or what's closest to your own voice, do you think, as a writer?
Well, I think memoir for me is the easiest to write because I'm open. I'm an open kind of person, and I'm reflective as well of what kinds of events have affected my personality and that sort of thing. But it was, in fact, more fun to write the novel
Hmm.
because I had been confronted. I thought, I don't know how to make things up. I'm so darned honest that it's really hard for me to do any, to create something that didn't actually happen. But it was really fun actually putting it together and making a fiction out of the bones that I had of a story. So I would guess, I don't know, I think that's hard. That's a hard question. It was more fun to write the novel. It was easier to write the memoir.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed writing both of them. I enjoyed writing the self-help book too, No Spring Chicken, which was because I felt like it was valuable information to share with people. So I know so much about dealing with the world when your body is um, presenting challenges that you may not have had before. And I thought this would be helpful for people that are aging. And so I felt like I was doing valuable work there. So that was rewarding as well. I just like to write.
Well, what do you have? Are you working on anything now? Do you have works in progress? Are there books that you have planned?
I do not have a book planned because I am moving towards 80 years old. I feel like, I mean, it would take a couple, 2 or 3 years to write another book, and then you have to either prostrate yourself to a traditional publisher or pay to have a hybrid do it, which is what I've done in the past because they vet their work and they only will publish, She Writes Press will only publish really good books. They have to be well written. So the time involved has me promoting a book when I'm in my early 80s, and that's not the vision I had for my life because the promoting and marketing part is not easy. So what I've decided to do, I mean, it's, most writers are basically introverts, even if we're friendly. So, looking for places to promote your work is not high on our list of available traits. So, what I'm going to do is start writing short stories about a grandmother on my paternal side, my great 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 grandmother, because she has quite a story. So I'm going to start writing short stories, and I feel like I need to take some classes in it because I mean, I'm long-winded, obviously, so writing a book seems like a normal thing to do, but making a whole beginning, climax, and ending happen in a short period of time will be challenging for me. So I'm going to take some courses in that and start writing stories about my great 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 grandmother on my dad's side.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we will look forward to that. So in the meantime, while people are waiting for your next exciting project, where can people go to find more information about you and your books?
I have a website. It's FrancineFalk-Allen.com, and that's FrancineFalk-Allen.com. And that has all my books on it. And I do blog there some of the time. I haven't had time to do it since I've been promoting this book, but I do blog there some different topics. And then the books are sold any place you can get a book. I particularly like our local bookstore, Book Passage, and they have two locations, one in Marin County and one in San Francisco. But any independent bookstore can order them. They're distributed by Simon and Schuster, so they're easy to obtain. And of course, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and Bookshop is a great place to order books because they funnel the income to independent bookstores, and you can have your closest independent bookstore order the book that way, or you can have them mail it to you. So it's pretty available.
Good. Well, Francine, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with A Wolff in the Family. And we will keep our fingers crossed for the series of short stories. Look for that in the not too distant future, we hope. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacy. It's been great talking with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.